Holy Father, my name is Chris O'Leary, and I'm a survivor of abuse by a priest. I was abused when I was a child by Father Leroy Valentine at the Church of the Immaculata in St. Louis, Missouri, a suburb, Richmond Heights, Missouri. My abuse happened from 1977 to 1980, possibly into 1981. I'm putting this together for you, sending it to you, hoping that you will see this in anticipation of the meeting in Rome towards the end of this month. I've actually tried to get a message to you through the Papal Nuncio a couple weeks ago, but I never heard anything back from the Papal Nuncio, and I have no indication that the email message that I sent through the Papal Nuncio was ever received in Rome, so I'm sending in this form. The message I'm trying to get to you is so that you need to understand the nature of the problem. When I hear people talking about the problem, I do not hear them talking about what is the real problem, which is, by and large, the bishops and the hierarchy. By and large, children are safer. Protecting God's children here in St. Louis is working. That's not the problem. There's some minor problems within the implementation of that, how often it should happen, how long the sessions should be, but those are minor problems. The bigger problems, the major problems, and the problems that I don't see on the agenda for the Abuse Summit at the end of February have to do with the hierarchy. It's still the case that the hierarchy is where allegations of abuse go to die. Over in Kansas City, just a few hours away from here, you had the issues with Bishop Finn, who was convicted of failing to report child abuse. In my own case, and this is difficult for me to talk about, is the abuse of the abused. When I tried to get help from the Archdiocese of St. Louis, from Cardinal Timothy Dolan, from Archbishop Carlson and the other people at the Archdiocese of St. Louis, I received, instead of treatment, I received torment. I was tortured, I was tormented by them, and you need to understand that. I hope you'll see this, and then you'll look at this and understand that the agenda of the February meeting needs to reflect the abuse of the abused. By that I mean what is done to survivors who try to come forward and get help. Done primarily by bishops, but also done by monsignors and also by deacons. My abuse started in the confessional. We had face-to-face confession. This would be probably late 1977 or so. Father Leroy Valentine was new to the parish and was super friendly, was immediately involved with all the boys, the altar servers, and even the younger boys. I gravitated towards him, went to him for face-to-face confession, and he did things to me. He touched me in inappropriate ways. I would call it sexually exploited, sexually abused. I know that he did worse things to other people, but it doesn't really matter. He did things to me in confession. And I've reported that to the Archdiocese of St. Louis, what he did and that he did in 2002, also in 2011, and then later. And I have no indication that he has been excommunicated, and I heard the stories of the Opus Dei priest, and people were talking about how he needs to be excommunicated for violating the sacrament of confession. Well, I've never heard anything done about my abuser. Nobody's ever told me anything about any sanctions that were done against him in terms of excommunication. We'll talk about what has been done and hasn't been done about him and later. what started in face-to-face confession then moved into the rectory. Father Valentine would have us over to play board games. And during the course of that evening, we'd play board games, we'd eat pizza, but over the course of that night, he would single out one of us and take us. I think it happened one at a time, at least with me and one other guy. He would take us into another room where we would watch TV, and I think he was testing us then, testing to see whether we understood what he was doing, the sexual exploitation, the sexual abuse. But that progressed into, as I got older and became an altar boy, he would find out when my parents were out of town, which was usually right before the 4th of July, and he would have me come up to the rectory, to the church for what I remember as special training, where essentially he would show me things in the back of the sacristy that he shouldn't be telling me, but that he felt he could show me because he could trust me, and I was so mature and I could handle myself and I could handle this information. And he would do things to me. He would touch me. I'm not exactly sure how the time frame works, but I believe after one of those sessions, perhaps in the summer of 1980, again, right before the 4th of July or so, he then took me into the rectory under the guise of having a Coca-Cola with him, and he ended up sodomizing me, raping me in the basement of the rectory. And that's all. That's all I want to talk about that right now. I talk about it on my website if you want more details of exactly what happened. The problem, and what I'm referring to specifically and what I want to talk about today, is what happened when I tried to get help from the Archdiocese of St. Louis, and how horrible that was, and what I mean by the abuse of the abused. In March 2002, my abuser was named in the New York Times, and then also in the local papers. Father Leroy Valentine was named as an abuser. A call was put out by the Circuit Attorney's Office, Jennifer Joyce, and the Archdiocese. I called the Circuit Attorney's Office, and they never called me back. I always attributed that to a problem with the statute of limitations, but it could in fact be that they killed the investigation, because I have some concerns about the investigation that's being done by the Attorney General of the state of Missouri, whether that's actually a valid investigation, whether they've actually killed that or not. At whose behest, I don't know, but you could wonder if the Archdiocese of St. Louis is putting pressure on them and using their influence to influence their investigation. So in early March 2002, this would be right around the 2nd or the 3rd or so, I got a call back from someone with the Archdiocese of St. Louis. It was Bishop Timothy Dolan. I had known then Father Dolan at Immaculata, and he was aware of Father Valentine's interests in boys. And I know that then Father Dolan saw and knew that Father Valentine was bringing boys up to his room for what at best was testing or grooming behavior, and in my case turned into sexual exploitation and sexual abuse, touching. Father Dolan knew what was going on and never did anything about it at the time. So then, when he called me in March 2002, I was surprised. He was like, "Hey, it's Tim Dolan, Bishop Dolan," because we knew each other. He was the first priest. Bishop Dolan was the first priest that I ever knew. He came to Immaculata in '76, and then Valentine came in '77. So Bishop Dolan, he was an auxiliary bishop then, vicar for priests, I think. at the time. He called me. I told him the stories, what I just told you, a little bit more detail, a little more information about a bad experience or a bad memory I had of Father Valentine coming back from a mud cave trip. But again, I didn't remember anything explicit. But Bishop Dolan immediately told me, with no investigation whatsoever, he said, and I can quote this because it's just burned in my brain. I was at the seminary with Leroy Valentine. I lived at Immaculata in the rectory with Leroy Valentine. I know that Leroy Valentine didn't do any of the things that he's accused of. I know that Leroy Valentine could never do anything to hurt a child. And because it was Bishop Dolan, who I'd known since third grade, 1976, I took him at his word that just nothing happened. Now, he did say at the end of the conversation, he was like, well, if you want to talk to someone, I can make that happen. So I ended up talking to a woman that I believe was Nancy Brown. She was the assistance coordinator for the Archdiocese of St. Louis at the time, although she was presented as an independent psychologist by Bishop Dolan. She again told me that nothing happened, that I was just misinterpreting what Father Valentine was doing and what he was trying to do. And that word misinterpreting is burned into my brain. So I just put it all behind me. Because I had a newborn, I had a baby who was maybe 2 months or 2 weeks old or so. We were in the trenches, we were busy. Bishop Dolan told me nothing happened. An independent psychologist, Nancy Brown, told me nothing happened. So I just went on with my life. What I didn't know was that a couple days later, Father Valentine resigned. And I was never informed by Bishop Dolan or anyone that at the end of March 2002, Father Leroy Valentine resigned. This all happened under Cardinal Regali. And neither he nor Bishop Dolan bothered to notify me, to inform me that Father Valentine had resigned. And I didn't know about it because it ran in the New York Times, but I didn't read the New York Times. And I wasn't looking for stuff because Cardinal Dolan had told me nothing happened. It also ran on the Southeastern Missourian, but that's a tiny little paper in St. Louis. As far as I know, it only ran in those two papers. So I just went on with my life. By 2007, I had lost my job and was getting sick with what I didn't know. I explored a bunch of different diagnoses: Asperger's syndrome, ADHD. I knew I had depression. I had anxiety, but I wasn't willing to accept it. So then in May 9th, 2011, I went back to the Archdiocese of St. Louis for help. And the basic message was, are you sure this doesn't mean anything? I went back to them with the same exact stories. I added one more memory of wrestling, because that was one way that Father Valentine got in with boys, was he would teach us how to wrestle, and he would end up demonstrating stuff to us and his hand would slip, and that was how he would end up touching us and sexually exploiting us and sexually abusing us. So I went back to the Archdiocese of St. Louis, May 9th, 2011, met with a review team. There were problems with that meeting. Deacon Phil Hankin was running that meeting. The stated policy of the Archdiocese of St. Louis, and I think it was based on the USCCB, was that there were to be no lawyers present at that meeting. Well, not only was there one lawyer at that meeting, there were actually two lawyers at that meeting. I was never told that there were going to be lawyers there or invited to bring a lawyer. So I was shocked. And that's misconduct. That's the violation of trust and everything. But it gives you a sense of what the Archdiocese of St. Louis will do, and that's just the least of what they'll do. And what they have done. What I mean by the abuse of the abused. At the end of the meeting, Deacon Phil Hankin told me to get a book called Man Enough, which essentially blamed everything on my father. But I read the book, and what was in that book, while I had some father issues, they didn't at all fit what was in the book and the kind of sexual and gender stuff that I was dealing with. And then all the anxiety and the depression. It was a bogus diagnosis, I believe, to kind of send me off on it was a red herring designed to send me off on a wild goose chase. 2 months later, I ended up having to call Deacon Hangen saying, what's the deal? Are you guys have you made any judgment? Have you said anything about what's going on? Deacon Hangen told me that he wanted to talk to my psychologist, the psychologist that I was working with privately at the time on my, paying for on my own dime. I immediately, on that same day, within minutes of hanging up the phone from Deacon Hangen, I jumped in the car, went to my psychologist's office, filled out the paperwork that I needed to fill out in order for my psychologist and Deacon Hangen to be able to talk. And I remember that happened because I actually ended up having to do it twice. First time, I basically gave my psychologist a blank check, and he wanted me to come back and kind of reevaluate that and revisit it and tighten it up a little bit to protect him and myself and our relationship. So I did that. I filled up the paperwork twice. Deacon Phil Hangen of the Archdiocese of St. Louis, at the time the head of the Office of Child and Youth Protection, never called my psychologist. Never called him. That experience ended up creating huge problems and tensions between my psychologist and me because I didn't know who to trust. I mostly trusted my psychologist, but because I didn't understand what was his incentive to lie, but it ended up destroying our relationship, which I believe was the objective. And the USCCB, the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops, talks about assistance coordinators. At no point during that process was I ever told of the existence of, contacted by, told to contact an assistance coordinator. It's a sham. I've had some people tell me that, well, I wasn't contacted by the assistance coordinator because I had a private psychologist, but Deacon Hangen never contacted my psychologist. And as I said, I got upset with my psychologist and asked him, why wasn't he pushing harder on this? And he told me, in 20 years of doing this, I've never had someone who wanted to talk to me fail to get in touch with me. And that was good enough for me. He did what he needed to do. My psychologist did what he needed to do. And that made me start to understand the game that the Archdiocese of St. Louis was playing. And I ended up coming up with the nickname of Runaround Phil for Deacon Phil Hangen, and that's a name that's based on my experiences and conversations with at least one other survivor. Deacon Phil Hangen, his job was not to help us. His job was to just give us the runaround and delay, hope that we'll go away. I presume in an attempt to create a problem with the statute of limitations, an effort that sadly in my case was successful. One of the worst parts for me, one of the worst days for me, one of the worst days of my life was in May 2013 when Father Leroy Valentine was permanently removed from public ministry, and I was never notified, warned, told that was going to happen by any member of the Archdiocese of St. Louis. My psychologist had to call me and warn me, and she's like, have you seen the paper? The Post-Dispatch and the Riverfront Times, they both said that Father Valentine's been permanently removed. That, obviously destroyed me, and what was even worse was the fact that I was now, just as in 2011 in March when Father Valentine resigned and I wasn't contacted, the same way in May 2013, when Father Leroy Valentine was permanently removed from ministry, and I'd made allegations against him twice, first to Cardinal Dolan, then to the review team led by Deacon Phil Hankin. I was never contacted. It was like I didn't exist. The Archdiocese of St. Louis they had no concern for me. In the release announcing the permanent removal of Father Valentine, they said that, and this is worse, this is twisting the knife. They said that Father Valentine was being permanently removed because of allegations made by someone who came forward in the summer of 2012. Well, I was dying to know at the time who that was. I have a bunch of names in my head of who it could be, and if I could talk to them, I would just ask them, could you please just tell me who came forward? Was it this guy or this guy or this guy? And why didn't you believe me? Because remember, they said they removed Valentine in May 2013 because of someone who came forward in the summer of 2012. I came forward in May 2011. So that means two of us came forward with allegations against Father Valentine. They removed Father Valentine because of the allegations made by that person in 2012, and they just ignored me. And I should also mention, speaking of the misconduct of bishops, also involved in the story, besides Cardinal Timothy Dolan, is Cardinal Justin Regali, Bishop Rick Sticca, and Cardinal Raymond Leo Burke. Cardinal Regali was running the Archdiocese of St. Louis in 2002 when I came forward. Cardinal Dolan, or then Bishop Dolan, was working for Regali, basically as his fixer. When Valentine resigned, he was moved. They just cut him loose, and he lived in a private residence for some period of time. I think 2 or 3 years, possibly longer. So a multi-accused predator, probably at least 6, maybe 7 allegations against Father Leroy Valentine. A multi-accused sexual abuser of children was just cut loose and set to live within an unsuspecting public by Bishop Dolan, Cardinal Regali. That policy was continued when Cardinal Burke took over and Bishop Sticca took over from Bishop Dolan as the fixer for the Archdiocese of St. Louis. Valentine, I was never notified when he resigned. Regali didn't reach out to me, Dolan didn't reach out to me. When Burke took over and Sticca took over, neither one of them reached out to me to say, okay, so we've got this guy who resigned, and you've got an allegation against him. Do you need some help? Now, in the May 2011 meeting, they told me that they had no record of my meeting and my conversations with Cardinal Dolan. Maybe that's true. Maybe Cardinal Dolan hid my existence and the existence of some other people from the Archdiocese of St. Louis. It basically to hide his involvement. Because remember, Cardinal Dolan saw and knew what Father Valentine was doing. He may not known all of it, but he knew that Valentine was grooming boys, that he was taking boys up to his room, that he had a fixation on boys, that he would take boys on trip. Altar boys and other boys, younger boys. When Burke and Sticca took over, no attempt was made to contact me. Maybe Dolan did cover everything up, in which case it's bizarre that he was allowed to investigate, and he was allowed to investigate allegations in which he's involved. Remember, so Dolan's living with Valentine, covering up his behavior, and then, lo and behold, Dolan is allowed to investigate those allegations, which then provides him with the opportunity to cover it up, to hide the information, assuming that actually happened the way the Archdiocese said it did. Obviously, I don't trust them. I went back to, In 2013, I had gotten to know Monsignor Richard Haneke, who was the vicar for priests, from my work at St. Elizabeth of Hungary. I didn't know the org chart, but my idea was to try to go over Hangen's head. I didn't know how the archdiocese is organized, but I know that a Monsignor outranks a deacon. So I went, and I knew that Monsignor Haneke was relatively highly placed within the archdiocese. So I went to Monsignor Haneke, asked him for help, and explained what Deacon Hangen was doing. Haneke was initially receptive and apologetic and shocked and everything, but then in the second meeting he was just ice cold, and he was just like, you need to work through Deacon Hangen. And I'm like, well, Hangen's not doing anything. He's just giving me the runaround. Yes, on a couple of occasions he told me, send me a treatment plan, but that's not a proactive action, and he never offered to pay for it, and I have no idea how much a treatment plan costs to prepare. I was destitute at the time. I'm still destitute. I've got maybe $100 to my name right now. I was in no better position back then. While Dolan screwed me over in 2002, at least he paid for my visit with Nancy Brown. Neither Deacon Hangen nor Monsignor Haneke ever offered to pay for anything. Therapy, no treatment plan. Hangen was 2 or 3 times he said, send me a treatment plan, but that's not a proactive it's not a proactive, serious offer. It's not a loving offer. It's just more go away. And what's interesting is, and this is criminal behavior. I'm going to talk about now. I'm going to talk about perjury, and I'm talking about obstruction of justice, and this gets into the Missouri Attorney General investigation, which is why it bothers me so much that 5 months later I haven't been contacted by the Missouri Attorney General. Eric Schmidt, who's a devout Catholic, I know his first assistant is also a devout Catholic. I know a lot of those guys, they're in my parish or my former parish.